Hello, my name is Gene Carney, and I'd like to invite you to spend a few minutes with me. Over the last several years, I've realized that my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and so forth probably wouldn't know very much about me. So I've decided to gather together some photographs and some pictures and help share my story. As a young child, I was always interested in painting, music, but my biggest asset has always been these hands. So sit back and enjoy with me, if you will, a look back.
I was born at the Phelps County Hospital in Rolla, Missouri on November 1st, 1953. My given name is Eugene Davis Carney, but I've always gone by the name of Gene. Now, of course, my family refers to me as G-Pa. My parents were Roe L. Caney Carney, a local Rolla boy, and Margaret Mary Cuddy of St. Louis. I had an older brother by 2 years. His name was Edwin Roe, and we affectionately called him Eddie, and a sister just 4 years older than me, Teresa Jean, whom we affectionately called Terry. My grandparents were Doc and Leora Carney, both of Rolla, Missouri, and Emily and Edward Cuddy, both of St. Louis. My father owned the movie theaters in and around Rolla, so I grew up in the theater business myself. The Uptown Theater was just 4 feet away from my grandparents' home. My grandfather, Doc, was a businessman in Rolla, but he owned numerous other businesses in neighboring cities. My father would work for the business during the day and then manage the theaters until around 11 o'clock each night. As a result of his schedule, I seldom spent quality time with my father. My mother ran the household and saw that we all had dance and piano lessons, and she was the reason we all attended elementary school at St. Patrick's Grade School. With the exception of math and science, it was a very good education for me. In place of organized sports, my classmates and I would often go caving on the weekends, a dirty business, to say the least. Upon completion of my 8 years at St. Patrick's, it was on to public school for me. Looking back, I guess it was just about the best 4 years I could have ever dreamt of. My time at Rolla High was equally divided. I was a cross-country and track long-distance runner coached by Scott Rust that resulted in a scholarship to UMR. I was in marching band and stage band, playing the trumpet, but I was much more invested in playing in our rock band. Started in 8th grade, we were known as Malcolm, Truth, McKinley Review, and other names. I usually played the trumpet and sang, but my heart was always with the drums. We played everywhere, from the pubmobile to many different homecomings and proms throughout the state. Somehow, I was able to get a job at the local rock radio station, KCLU. This was a dream job for a high school kid, and I never really got the thrill of being a top 40 DJ out of my system.
Low tonight around 30, high tomorrow in the 50s, currently outside 39. A weekend, 24 minutes away from 9 o'clock, the St. James Kiwanis.
I would say that my most meaningful high school experience, however, was learning that I could paint. This was my very first oil portrait, and it was due to the generosity of Mr. Earl Strebeck. He allowed me to go in my own direction, which led to a lifetime of confidence in all things creative. Because of these paintings, I was awarded Most Artistic, an honor I shared with Bill Wesley. After graduating from high school in 1972, I spent several years doing various jobs, including working at KTTR, another local radio station, KBIC in Corpus Christi, and then back to KCLU in Rolla. That's when I first started to develop a flair for creativity. I convinced the management there to let me try and break the world's record for the longest continuous broadcast. After several months of planning, I started that venture on October 7th of 1976. I managed to make it 9.5 days. That's 24 hours around the clock on the air without sleep. Well, I ended up falling into a deep sleep less than a day before I would have set the record. Needless to say, I was crushed that I'd come so close, yet didn't quite cross the finish line. After a couple of weeks in a deep depression, I decided it was time for a change. Throwing caution to the wind, I moved to San Diego, California with a girl that I had been dating. I started to study for the FCC engineering license, and I found that I loved electronics. Upon acquiring the license, I was immediately hired as an electronics engineer at SeaWorld in San Diego. I'd gotten married during this time period, and we had ourselves a daughter that we named Crystalline Ray. She was a darling little girl, and she's grown up to be a beautiful and dedicated teacher. Unfortunately, though, at the time, things didn't work out for us as a family, and we went our separate ways. I found myself with a little extra time on my hands, so I started designing and building stained glass objects of art. I got to be pretty good at it because I was searching for a creative art form while trying to build a portfolio at the same time. SeaWorld presented me with just the outlook I needed. It was a very special environment because they needed gadgets and gizmos that couldn't be bought elsewhere. I would see a need, suggest a solution, and start designing and building just that. I developed an underwater system to communicate with killer whales and dolphins. I developed wireless microphones and customized them for each of the show's performers. I was able to conceive and build the Sky Tower Christmas tree lights that used an Apple II with stage and theater software to control the tree, while the lights were dancing to the music. With a job like that, you'd have to wonder why I would ever leave, but I was searching for a creative art form. After 5 years, I started feeling once again like I needed a change, so I left SeaWorld for a job as an electronic research and development manager for a company by the name of Bentex. Bentex had one mission: to build a prototype of the Sprint 101 underwater vehicle, $250,000 worth of underwater vehicle. I was in charge of designing the circuit boards using CAD software and then assisted in building the actual submarine. Once the vehicle prototype was completed, I felt it was time to move on again. I accepted a job at Power and Wind Marine Electronics as service manager. This was a unique opportunity as well. I was able to use and repair electronics from around the world, including radar, sonar, autopilots, and on and on. It was at this time, in 1988, when my creative juices really started to flow. I saw a need for a low-cost underwater vehicle. We call them underwater drones today, but it's the same thing. I started working on my first prototype design, testing it in my bathtub. I eventually produced the Sand-Dollar 1000. I was machining all the parts, designing and building the electronics, and even making the fiberglass body. This, as you can see, was a thing of beauty, and this design can still be seen today in long-range underwater drones. Before I was finished, I was already planning its successor. Of course, all of this was at my own cost. I was working weeknights and weekends, and yet I was still yearning to build something more agile in the water. Several months later, I introduced the Microsub 2000. This submarine featured independently controlled thrusters, as you can see, that could fly like a helicopter one moment or an airplane the next. It was totally unique in the world. And as I was demonstrating the vehicle one time at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, a man approached me. He owned a company that produced underwater camera housings. These are the type that divers would use. Well, he asked if I could build a system that would work as an accessory for his products. Of course, I said yes. And a few months later, we debuted the QHL 2000. This was my first four-thruster vehicle, so I was in new territory. The QHL stood for Quest, the name of his company, and HL, which stood for Hydrologic, the name of mine. Throughout this entire part of my life, my best friend at the time, Warren Meals, did all of the underwater filming and photography for my company. He always did this for me at no charge. We worked together on various projects, and he had one of my dropped video systems. Unfortunately, we lost him in an accident in Mexico in 1992. This man was not just a great friend to me, but he believed in me. He was a staunch supporter of my lifestyle and my vision, which was design and build as much as possible in a short amount of time. As all of this was going on, I had to keep making improvements in my thrusters. Namely, I engineered a unique magnetic coupling and stepped up the machining quality. New electronics were needed, and I was really starting to enjoy myself. As the camera houses became smaller, I introduced the Probe 350, my first 5-thruster vehicle. Several of these systems were sold overseas, but I just couldn't resist other opportunities that were starting to present themselves. I was approached by Teleview, a San Diego company. They wanted to see if I could develop an antenna that could be mounted on a yacht at sea and track land-based TV signals of the America's Cup races. Of course, I said yes, and I developed the system that you see here. I was able to produce about 40 of these devices before and during both America's Cup races. As all this was going on, I started to design the Hydrologic Microsub 5000. I built a prototype of this amazing device, but soon my attention was diverted once again. This time, it was the Navy calling me. I was approached by Naval Research and Development to build a custom dropped video system like none other in the world. I offered up my design, the DVS-1, which stood for Dropped Video System. It could fit through a 4-inch hole drilled in the ice. This was a huge take-on for me. There was no room for error. And so, after successful demonstrations to the Navy, I sold the system to NRAD, Naval Research and Development. I was amped up. A one-man show selling a complicated underwater dropped video system to the Navy? That was almost unheard of. It was about this time that I was visited by a funny little Chinese man. He represented a Taiwanese squid fishing industry company. He asked me if I could build something to use over the side of the fishing boats to observe the squid. It needed to be illuminated with infrared light. Well, that's never been done before underwater, so I went for it. And within 4 months, I designed and built the Dropped Video System 2. I would also take credit for designing the special slip ring contacts, which would reappear in several of my projects down the road. At some point, I started working on the infrared lighting for this project, but I could not solve the infrared heat problem, and so I could not deliver the project. The unit was completely operational, but it did not produce infrared lighting. Therefore, I refunded the money to the Chinese man and said I was sorry. This was the first time I had suffered a failure. But luckily for me, my friend Warren Mills was interested, and with a few modifications and accessories, he took delivery of this magnificent piece of engineering, the DVS-2. By this time in 1993, I'd started working full-time under the name of Hydrologic. I had a client who owned a beautiful ocean-going sailboat, coincidentally named Quest. His goal was to have the most electronically advanced sailboat in the world, and he turned me loose. I was really good at computer-generated documentation, and I loved doing that part of all of the projects. I sold, installed, and then trained him on the use of all of the electronics on board. One day I was discussing how cool it would be to have a pan and tilt camera installed up on the mast. Well, he immediately gave me the go-ahead, and I designed the Mastcam 1. There was nothing on the market like this. I was so excited. It worked really well, but before I was finished with it, I was already designing its successor, the Mastcam 2. Now, the Mastcam 2 was smaller. It had better long-range lights, and like many of my designs, this one could have made it to the market. I was thinking about this when something happened. A friend of mine had recommended me for a subcontractor position at a company called General Atomics. The project was the all-electric jet fighter. I was so happy to have an opportunity to work on this prestigious project at this prestigious company that I put aside everything I was doing and went to work for them. General Atomics is located in beautiful Torrey Pines, California, and I remember being at work one day in 1996 and receiving a call that my father had passed away. Several months after his funeral, I returned to his home in Rolla, Missouri, and I evaluated the machine shop and the theater that were built into his home. Since my brother and sister were uninterested in the machine shop or the theater, I bought both of their interests out and became sole owner of my father's invention. This prompted me to return home for just 2 months. You see, I'd been offered a new project at General Atomics, and I was fully expecting to return to San Diego. While I was in Rolla, I met a beautiful girl named Judy, and I completely fell in love. I did not expect what happened next. I proposed, she accepted, and 6 months later we were married. I resigned from General Atomics and moved everything back home to Rolla. This was a new chapter for me, and I started completely fresh. For the next 20 years, I worked on rotoscope, one way or another. But at the time, I needed a job. Judy and her brother Bob and Dennis owned a business called Wilson Lumber and Rental. It wasn't long before I was doing work for them, and by 2022, I was hired to manage the lumberyard. This was a complete shift for me, and I had so much to learn. I now was living the family life. Judy had 3 wonderful high school children, Matt, Katie, and Jeremy, so I didn't have much time for special projects. Judy and I did have a lot of fun at the lumberyard, and there were many chances to do creative things, lots of building repairs, floats, and opportunities to build things like the Gumball Man, Santa, and the Forestry Board. I continued to experiment with rotoscope, hosting many private showings over the years. All of the film was digitized, and I replaced the large, noisy ARC projector with a new high-tech LCD projector. It became so easy to demonstrate that we had numerous showings for family and friends, and I will always be grateful that I had a chance to enjoy my father's invention. But I wasn't sure exactly what direction to go in. As fate would have it, we sold the lumberyard and the rental center in 2012, and we were able to fully retire at the young ages of about 60. Within 3 months, I was offered a job at KMST from Wayne Bledsoe. This was a university NPR station. I had a smooth jazz show each day from noon to 1 called The Mix. Well, smooth jazz was a California thing, so it was met with mixed reactions here in Rolla. But I was able to do it for 3 years before the station was shut down, and I must say I have a pretty nice collection of smooth jazz now.
Working on a hit that was a #1 hit of the nation for 12 consecutive weeks just a couple of years ago. It's called Put the Top Down.
With the freedom that retirement brings, and with the support of my sweet wife Judy, this new phase of life had unlimited potential for the special projects that I was so accustomed to. I had always wanted to return to painting, but I wasn't sure I could still do it. I started with a portrait of Ira Wilson, Judy's father. That started me down a road of portrait painting for many members of our family. Here's just a few examples right now of my paintings, even some still lifes in the mix. During my entire career, I was constantly filming all of my activities. I've done many graduation videos in my time, and I love storytelling. I love telling sweet stories with just the right music, as well as funny videos that we used to make on a regular basis back in the lumberyard days. By 2024, I had produced well over 150 videos. I believe that one of the biggest projects I was ever able to work on was the conversion of the 35mm rotoscope film to digital media. As I mentioned before, the rotoscope project was very near and dear to me, and I even made a documentary on the subject in 2018. I edited the films into short segments, added some background music and text, and put all the clips on YouTube for the public to enjoy. When I reached a point where I could no longer do anything with the system, I gifted the entire collection to the Missouri Historical Society. I gave it all: projector, film, letters from my father and the patent office, photographs. Well, it just goes on and on. I always took great satisfaction in knowing that my father would have been pleased. I must say that when one is looking for inspiration, there's nothing quite like grandchildren. From Wilson, Annie, Bear, and Becca, I've done portraits, videos, and some special projects that I'm very proud of. I've put my hands to work, making Wilson a train and Annie a bed. Annie got a bookshelf as well, with dancing ballerinas, music, and lights. My grandson Bear got a bookshelf with lights and music as well. We can't forget about Becca's bookshelf with unicorns, lights, and music. These projects really filled my heart because they had a purpose of making my grandchildren happy. Another satisfying project was building the R2-D2 replica. My friend's daughter was so enamored with that character that I made a replica for her. It was powerful and could drive up and down the street. It could respond to voice commands or remote control. It actually spoke the language of R2-D2 and had lights to boot. I'm told to this day she still speaks about it lovingly. Sometime in 2020, I had the desire to build something that would include all kinds of mechanical things like gears, motors, and such. I remembered one time taking Annie on a carousel ride, and that was all it took. Over about 1.5 years, we built our carousel. Blinking lights, music, and motion. I say we because Judy has always been involved with everything I do. I sought her opinion on everything from concept to color choices. I always refer to my life as having two parts: life before Judy and life with Judy, although now she is lovingly referred to as Nana. Recently, I came across a watercolor rendering that I'd done some 45 years ago. It was of some butterflies on a tree of some sort. It was a concept painting that I was planning on making into a stained glass door. And I never made the door, but when I came across the painting, another light went off in my brain and I started building. Here we are right now at this point, so it's our work in progress. In the last several years, I've had the opportunity to build some practical things as well. Our subdivision sign, our photo booth arbor, and how about 3 matching birdhouses? On Father's Day in 2024, the family bought me something that I'd always wanted, a drone. And since then, I've used it to take stunning imagery from many of our friends' homes and local places of interest. Here is Merrimack spring in the summer. And here, Lookout Point with Dave and Wilson. Oh, so majestic and so beautiful. I've had many mixed emotions about the paths I've chosen in life. I guess most people do. But I've always been grateful for my hands.
Well, that's about the whole show. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch with me some of my special projects. You know, it was never about money. It was never about fame. I was blessed with hands that could do almost anything, and that was my passion. Thank you to my beautiful wife, Judy, for supporting me all these years. I'm Gene Carney, and thanks for taking a look back.